What's good? What's good, Card Nation? Welcome into this week's episode of Around the ACC with DP, part of the Cardinal Sports Zone Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Couple of improvements being put on display today. The graphic overlay, if you are watching this, shout out to my guys, TJ Barr and Jeremy Wallman for getting me hooked up with the sweet graphic overlay and also the little intro video that y'all saw. Some really nice additions to the show. The only thing that won't be happening today, won't be welcoming on our first guest yet. Had some scheduling conflicts, so it's going to be another solo show. But by all means, the matchup with Virginia next week, that week's episode of Around the ACC with DP will feature at least one co-host. But we have enough to talk about on the show today, so I hope you won't get too bored or too over hearing my voice for the next 30 minutes or so. But we have a good show planned for you today. But let's go ahead and get the unfortunate discussion out of the way. Louisville, first loss of the season, Notre Dame last Saturday. It was a really, really tough performance. Not really good from the offense or defense or special teams. The coaching could have been better. So it was sort of a systems misfire across all fronts for our Louisville Cardinals. And even to that point, they still had a chance to win the game at the end of regulation. They're at the 50-yard line. Unfortunately, it just wasn't in the cards. No pun intended or pun intended, depending on your mood this morning or this afternoon, whenever you're listening to this. But overall, I'm not a huge fan of moral victories. Like, you will never find me saying, well, it might as well be a moral victory. No, the only thing that matters is the win-loss column. I do, however, believe that you can take some positives from performances, situational pluses, and there are silver linings. And the main silver lining coming from that loss is that it doesn't affect Louisville's conference championship hopes. The only thing it does is affect the national perception. Like, if you were to ask me which of the two scenarios are more likely, Louisville gets into the college football playoffs as an at-large, or they get into the college football playoffs by winning the Atlantic Coast Conference, I'm going with the latter every day of the week and twice on Sundays. Because here's the reality. We mentioned the perception of the ACC is just not really all that good. It's probably the lowest that it has been since the Cardinals joined the ACC, and that's not hyperbolic. That's just the reality. Florida State is not good. We know that Florida State was the first and only college football Power 5 team to not make the 4-team college football playoff after going undefeated. So the perception takes a hit right there, right? Couple that with Florida State being bad this year, the ACC just not really being all that convincing, although Miami looks good, Clemson looks good. You do have Louisville in the top 25 as well, and then some other teams. But nonetheless, if you're looking for the conference to receive their flowers across the country, you're going to be looking for a long time. It's just not going to come, at least not right now. So Louisville, I mentioned, to make the college football playoff as an at-large team, not getting one of the buys, you were going to have to go at least 10-2. So, I mean, there is a chance that the Cardinals could theoretically run the table and get into the college football playoff at 11-1, which I do believe that they would, with wins over Clemson, Kentucky, and Miami. But the probability of that happening is just not all that high at the moment. So I do think that Louisville loses at least one more game. Can the Cardinals get in at 10-2? That's the main question. And honestly, if they don't win the ACC, they're going to have 3 losses, right? I mean, you don't expect them to run the table in conference play. So technically a 9-3 team. Let's say, put it this way, let's say that Louisville wins out in the regular season conference play and they lose in the ACC championship game. So they are, 11-2 record-wise? Even if you put it that way, looking at the rankings currently, and the rankings currently aren't going to reflect the rankings here in a couple months, but look how many SEC teams you have. You have Alabama, Texas, Tennessee, Georgia, Missouri, LSU, and Mississippi all in the top 15. You look at the ACC, right? Miami, Clemson, Louisville in the top 25. Notre Dame is on the outside looking in. Big Ten's got some teams in. Michigan, USC, Penn State, Oregon, Ohio State. There's only one automatic bye that's going to come from those two conferences. So you factor in the 4 or 5 automatic buys, the rest of the teams, well, you're going to have Texas, Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, Missouri, all in that conversation. Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State. Put it this way, there's going to be a lot of teams competing for only so many spots. And if you're sitting there telling me that the College Football Playoff Committee is not going to try to push a Big Ten or SEC team into the playoff that might have a slightly worse record than an ACC team, I would tell you to wake up. Because that's the reality that we're living in right now. You've seen the push that the SEC and Big Ten are trying to get to a point to where by 2026, there are 4 automatic buys coming from those two conferences. You need to look at the reality here, and that's that the ACC is not in a good spot. And I really wish we were hosting around the SEC or around the Big Ten. But right now, the ground that the ACC stands on is really, really shaky. And people might decide to turn a blind eye and say, well, the problems aren't bad right now. Well, the trickle-down effect is real. The perception of the ACC is very real, and it's very bad at the moment. So they're going to do everything in their power to keep a non-conference champion ACC team out of the playoffs. It would not be the wildest stretch of imagination to suggest that the only ACC team that makes it in is the conference champion. That's the reality. That's the reality that I look at. So Louisville, I say all that to come back to the main point that Louisville's best chance at making the playoff is taking the decision out of the committee's hands. You win the ACC, it doesn't matter what they say. You're automatically in. You automatically have a bye. And that loss to Notre Dame doesn't give you a conference loss, and it keeps your conference championship hopes alive. Because what I think the recipe to getting back to Charlotte is for Louisville, there are 2 prerequisites. And this is all under the assumption that Clemson and Miami are going to do what they're supposed to do, because you look at their schedules respectively, and Clemson, they play Louisville, but they don't play Miami. They have Pittsburgh, Virginia Tech, Virginia, Wake Forest, and Florida State. All those games, Dabo Swinney's team should win. Now, again, you might lose to a team you're not supposed to, but on paper, Clemson should run the table. And then you look at Miami. Like, they have a very interesting matchup this week against Cal. They do have to go to Louisville. But after that, Florida State, Duke, at Georgia Tech, very interesting matchup there. Wake Forest and Syracuse, so they don't have to play each other. Louisville is in a disadvantageous spot because they're the only team out of the top 3 in my opinion. I think Louisville, Miami, and Clemson are the 3 best teams in the conference. Clemson and Miami do not play each other. They only play Louisville. So by default, Louisville is in a very interesting situation. So if Clemson and Miami handle their business, Louisville is forced to do 2 things. Number 1, they're going to have to run the table outside of those 2 games in conference play. Like, they're going to have to defeat SMU. They're going to have to defeat Virginia and Stanford and Boston College and Pittsburgh, partially because at this point, Louisville's in a 6-way tie at 1-0. Like, Boston College, SMU, and Virginia don't have conference losses. You need to, number 1, give them those conference losses. Number 2, own the tiebreaker over those schools. And number 3, just put yourself in the best position to get. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the more teams that you can have a tiebreaker over, because I mean, who knows with Boston College, Thomas Castellanos' availability is really going to affect things, how much he's going to miss time, because Boston College really did not look good last week against Western Kentucky. They barely beat them at home. You have a SMU team that, hey, the Pony Bros are pretty exciting. They're a lot better than people want to give them credit for. Like, Saturday's game against SMU is a must-win game. More on that coming up here shortly. And then Virginia, I don't think Virginia is better than Louisville, but they are playing in Charlottesville, a place that Louisville just struggles for some reason. You have to go undefeated in conference play outside of Clemson and Miami because it puts you in that conversation to where I'm not sure that Clemson and Miami both of them have over one conference loss. That brings me to the second spot. You have to split those two games. You have to defeat Clemson or Miami. Now, you can defeat both and make it all a moot point, but at the very worst, you have to defeat one or the other because it's going to give you that head-to-head over one of those teams. And assuming that you run the table the rest of the way, you're going to have one conference loss. You're probably going to go up against the other team that could be undefeated in conference play, and you're going to hold the tiebreaker over one of those, or one of the Clemson and Miami teams that you defeat. So that's the main thing here. I think that that's the best way to get to the college football playoff, and that's the recipe for success getting to the ACC championship game. Now, to the point that I made, SMU is as a must-win of a situation as they come. Now, obviously, if you're taking my words into consideration, every ACC game at this point becomes a must-win, but especially this one because you just got punched in the mouth. You had a really tough performance that you made some key self-inflicting mistakes. This is back-to-back weeks where the performances haven't been the greatest. You got punched in the mouth. The season is ahead of you. You control your own destiny, but you've got to turn things around. You need a good performance against SMU because if you lose this game, all of the it reminds me of like the Scott Satterfield, like his last season when you had all the offseason hype with the recruiting and then the balloon got deflated when you lost to Syracuse. You have all this hype of, yeah, Louisville can really compete for the ACC. You lose to SMU, the air in the balloon is going to rapidly decrease. And that's sort of the reality of the situation that we are in at the moment. Because if you go to 3-2, that means you would have to pretty much run the table in the ACC. The national perception of you continues to solidify itself as you being a pretender and not a contender. Because I know all the people listening to this that claim that they're a Louisville fan likely believe that Louisville doesn't get enough flowers, that they're better than what we saw against Notre Dame, and they're better than the national perception. But as the old saying goes, you are who your record says you are. I don't care if Louisville should have, could have, would have beaten Notre Dame. The reality is you lost. That's all it comes down to. You're 3-1. There's not an asterisk next to that record saying 3-1, should have beat Notre Dame. No, you have to beat the teams on your schedule. And I would argue that you have to have some sort of style points behind it because last year you got the wins. Really weren't many style wins outside of maybe that Virginia Tech game, right? Maybe or outside of the Boston College win. You need to go out and you need to make a statement for the first time this season and say, oh yeah, we're as good as people claim we are to be. So that's the main thing here. SMU is a must-win game for the Louisville Cardinals. That's how I feel. Let's look at English. Let's look at the rest of the conference. I love to speed my words up, and it just sounds like gibberish. And people on my Locked On Louisville show, for those that don't know, I do host a daily podcast called Locked On Louisville. They love to just hound on those mistakes and say, oh, you can't speak. I guess not. I mean, I just have so many thoughts that I try to get out there, and I just speak them pretty quickly. But let's look at the conference. Last week was an interesting one. I don't think there were any groundbreaking revelations. Miami was the main thing. The whole whether or not it was a catch or not, who cares? Miami got the win. Virginia Tech lost that game. Brent Pry is not getting the criticism that he deserves for some of the calls that he made. The fake field goal was one of the more questionable calls. I'm sitting there going, what did I just watch? It was bad. Virginia Tech sold. They should have won this game. They had the lead for the majority, moving from like the second quarter on. But shout out to Cam Ward for making things happen. And Miami ended up winning that game. That game showed me two things. Number one, you have to play a game without making many mistakes to beat Miami, but also to play the other side of the fence. Miami is not this juggernaut team that you have to play out of your mind to beat. You just have to keep it clean. You have to force turnovers on Cam Ward, and you have to play your game. But if you're playing a better team than Virginia Tech, Miami probably has one loss on their schedule coming into this week. Like, Miami's a very winnable game. It's at Louisville. It's going to be very winnable. Like, I don't think Miami is this juggernaut that people believe. Yes, they have some injuries. Ruben Bain hasn't played yet. But at the end of the day, I fear Clemson much more, especially with that game on the road. But if you were to play both of those games on a neutral playing field, I still think Clemson's the tougher team. I think Clemson is the best team in the ACC at this current moment. Cade Klubnik has been really good lately. He hasn't gotten the praise that he deserves. That's a really good defense. Garrett Riley has done a great job as the offensive coordinator down in South Carolina. Clemson is sort of flying under the radar, and they are demolishing teams. They thumped NC State. They thumped Stanford, two teams that probably aren't the greatest, but they're doing it in style. Clemson's the best team in the ACC at the moment. That's my opinion. Also around the ACC, Boston College, without Thomas Castellanos, had to come back late in the fourth quarter to beat Western Kentucky. NC State beat Northern Illinois, who defeated Notre Dame. That was 24-17. Syracuse blew out Holy Cross. Let's see. Wake Forest lost to the Louisiana Raging Cajuns. Dave Clawson's team is now 1-3 on the season. They are continuing to slide. SMU turned Florida State's argument to keep the Mustangs out of the ACC into, well, maybe we should kick FSU out of the conference. No wonder FSU didn't want the Mustangs in the conference. If you watched any part of that game on Saturday night, my goodness, the Pony Bros, and that's a key nickname. I don't know if that's been adopted by the fan base, but Isaac Shade, host of Locked On Tar Heels, we were on the ACC squad, which is a weekly episode where all the hosts of the Locked On ACC schools come on to just talk ball. He said the Pony Bros, and that's just I will say, the vibes surrounding the new ACC teams. Like, I don't get much interaction with Stanford fans, but like California's fan base, it's funny, man. They're a funny group. The Pony Bros, like, the vibes are incredible. Like, the ACC as a whole might not necessarily be doing great, but dude, the vibes are just great. The vibes are great. It reminds me of like old Big East vibes. The trash talk is funny. FSU being bad is low-key just hilarious because of all the trash they talk in the offseason. Louisville's checks are bouncing. Don't throw stones at glass houses. But nonetheless, SMU demolished Florida State. Duke, North Carolina sold. What a loss, man. Lost to Duke. It was, what was this game? Was it 20-0 midway through the third quarter, and Duke comes back to win 21-20. Look, I know that North Carolina doesn't have Max Johnson, but they've got Amari and Hampton, and I'm not really a big believer in this Duke team. What are we doing, man? I was looking forward to seeing Duke have that first conference loss, and I'm just still not sold on the Blue Devils. We'll find out this week when they play Georgia Tech, but North Carolina just absolutely sold, and that is the extent. Well, Clemson did demolish Stanford, and if you're wondering to see how the Stanford Cardinal were going to fare on the road against Clemson, spoiler alert, not good. So nothing really too shocking here outside of Virginia Tech giving Miami a game. As we look towards week 3 in the ACC, there are 3 matchups that I want to focus on the most outside of the Louisville game. The first one is Boston College at Virginia. Now, as this episode is being recorded, we really don't have much insight into the availability of Boston College quarterback Thomas Castellanos. But if they are without their star quarterback, I find it tough to believe that they're going to win this game. Virginia has been respectable. Anthony Calandria has been better than he was last season. And the Eagles struggled against Western Kentucky. Now you're telling me that they're going to go on the road to beat Virginia without Castellanos? I just find a tough time buying that. So that availability of Castellanos will be key here. Both teams have one loss. They are undefeated in conference play. I just do want to see a game between two of the opponents in the short term for the Louisville Cardinals. This is one to watch for just as a fan, just trying to get more data on ACC teams. The second game that I'm watching is Duke at Georgia Tech. As I mentioned, I'm still not a big believer in Manny Diaz's team. Like, all you can do is all you can do. Control what you can control. And shout out to his team for going 5-0 and 1-0 in conference play. Like, they're handling business. But they played Elon. They blew them out. They played Middle Tennessee, blew them out. But they've got three very unconvincing wins against Northwestern, UConn, and North Carolina, who really aren't that great of opposition, or opponents, I should say. So I'm really still not bought in. I think Georgia Tech is the best team that they will have played to date. They're going on the road down to the 404, playing in Bobby Dodd. I think that offense. Now, one thing that is not disputable is that Duke has a really good defense. Manny Diaz is known for being a really good defensive-minded coach. They've been a really good defense. Duke's really, even with Mike Elko, like, the Blue Devils' defense has always been really good. It's the main thing of how good's their defense, or how good's their offense, I should say. Malik Murphy has been decent, the Texas transfer. They've had a pretty good running game. That's been sort of their go-to on offense is setting the tone at the line of scrimmage. You're running the football. You're going up against a respectable defense. Arguably, I think is it better than Northwestern's? Maybe. But you're going to have to score points against a Georgia Tech offense that can score. Georgia Tech is a good football team prior to what their record shows. The third game to watch for is Miami at California. How this got College Game Day? I mean, the slate of games just must be downright miserable this week for Miami at California to get College Game Day. Maybe it's because they want to get a game out west. Hell, I don't know. But it is game day. California showed that they can take the ball away. They went down to Auburn and got the victory, but they also lost at Florida State. Florida State's been not good. There's many adjectives to describe their play on the field. I'm just going to settle with not good. So what California team are we going to see? Can California keep the vibes going? Can they hand Miami their first loss? But can they also just be competitive in this game? That's another game that I'm watching for. Miami has played 5 not good teams. We'll see how they do against California. Is California the best team they played so far? Drop a comment in the chat, see if y'all think so. But those are the 3 games to focus on. The 3 teams will also, you look around the conference. Let's talk about the other games. Clemson at Florida State. How that line is Clemson minus 14.5, I don't know. I would hammer that spread, especially with DJU maybe not playing, although that could be, I don't know. It could be better with him not playing. Virginia Tech at Stanford. Another game that just doesn't move me. Like, Virginia Tech has shown me all I need to see. If Stanford beats them, then I don't know what to say. Same thing with Wake Forest and NC State. Like, I'm just not impressed with either of those 2 teams, especially Wake Forest. NC State, I'm done vouching for that team. I was one to say that, yeah, this team could be really good. They have not shown that, at least just not yet. Syracuse at UNLV on Friday night. UNLV is ranked. They're 4-0. They had a quarterback who was really good. Say all he did about the NIL situation. He plans on redshirting and going into the portal, and UNLV got a dominant blowout victory over Fresno State. Will Syracuse be able to go on the road and get a ranked win? TBD. Still not sold on that team. So not really a bunch of great opportunities to get some great matchups, but who should Louisville be cheering for? Who are the three teams that you want to see win? Well, hopefully, I know this kills Louisville fans, but you need Florida State to win. I'm going to be a big Seminole fan for the only time this year on Saturday when they play Clemson. You want Clemson to get that first loss the same way I'm going to be a big California fan to give Miami that first loss. You need those two teams to pick up ACC losses. That is the main thing to focus on. But the other team, like who else do you want to see win? That's a weird thing for me. One game we didn't talk about, Pittsburgh at North Carolina. I would like to see North Carolina beat Pittsburgh because just like Duke, I'm not a huge believer in Pat Narduzzi's team this season until they show me otherwise. Like, yeah, you blew out Kent State, you blew out Youngstown State, but you beat West Virginia, who isn't all that good. They're 2-2. And then it took a valiant comeback to beat Scott Satterfield's Cincinnati Bearcats. Cincinnati hasn't beaten anybody either. They just lost to Texas Tech. Like, you were down in that game a lot. It was what, 27-6, and you were able to come back. Now, shout out to Eli Holstein and what he's been able to do. I think that they do have upgraded quarterback play this year. Again, all you can do is all you can do. They've won the games in front of them, but it hasn't been in a convincing manner. You look at the schedule that they play. They've got Clemson and Louisville, but I would just like to see them pick up a conference loss. They haven't played a conference game yet. I think Pittsburgh and Georgia Tech would be the two teams that I would cheer for in terms of ACC implications for Louisville's sake. Now, let's sort of wrap things up. What's at stake with this game for the Louisville Cardinals? Well, for starters, we've talked about why this is a must-win in case they lose. But what happens if they win or when they win? We're going to speak this into existence, y'all. Say it with me. Louisville will beat SMU. And if they don't, we'll blame Jeremy Wallman. Just because. Just because, why not? 55 just seems like we can blame him. You know, he probably wouldn't mind. But it won't matter because Louisville's going to win this game. When they do, what does it mean? Well, unfortunately, like with the Georgia Tech game, at this point, you're about a 6.5-point favorite according to FanDuel. When you're about a touchdown favorite, the only thing a win shows is that you handle business. But ultimately, that is significant in itself because a win is a win. And like I said, you would be turning the tide, reversing the momentum, and getting back in the win column, building the vibes back up, and getting the mood set right. That's what you need. You give SMU a conference loss. You own the tiebreaker over the Pony Bros. And you get that much closer to clinching an ACC bid. Or ACC championship bid, I should correct. Now, we are very early on in ACC play, but when I say that much closer, you're one game closer. It's just a matter of winning the games ahead of you, taking it week by week. I know it's easy to think big picture, but you also have to stay in the moment. Stay grounded in the moment. The only focus, that's why we talk about it on a weekly basis. Like, the focus has to be on this week. And the reality of the situation is we can have all these conversations, but unless Louisville handles business in conference play, a lot of this becomes a moot point, y'all. So Louisville has to handle business. So that is what it is. If you're looking at this graphic, you can find my Twitter at @dpence_, at Card Sports Zone to find all of our work. Cardinal Sports Zone on YouTube to watch all of the episodes of the Cardinal Sports Zone podcast, Live with 55, and much more. Looking to add some new shows to the network here in the next couple of months. Bringing some new co-hosts and guests on to this show particularly. Thanks again for tuning in. Be sure to check out all the great work over at Cardinal Sports Zone. Thanks to all of the sponsors of the show that make these opportunities possible. We couldn't do it without you all. Thanks to all that are tuning in via Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, you name it. Whatever streaming service you utilize, it definitely does not go unnoticed. Be sure to also check out Locked on Louisville, my daily podcast on everything Louisville Cardinals. Thanks again for making Locked on Louisville one of your first listens of the day. That is going to wrap up this episode. One thing I do want to implore, or one thing I do want to ask you all to do. Drop some questions that you all would like answered in a mailbag. We're going to have a mailbag to where we'll answer 3 to 5 questions on every show. Shows are going to be longer than 30 minutes when guests are brought on, but we will have some questions that are answered. So be sure to drop yours. That's going to wrap up this episode of Around the ACC with DP, part of the CSE Podcast Network.